The wild is unpredictable, and any hunt can turn into a fight for survival. From roaring grizzlies to charging boars, the line between hunter and hunted can vanish in a heartbeat. These true accounts drop you into the exact moments when danger erupted from the shadows. In this video, you'll hear 6 gripping encounters, from a grizzly's relentless assault in Alaska to a black bear scaling a hunter's stand in Minnesota. On August 27, 2022, the thick Alaskan wilderness was quiet except for the steady sound of water running over smooth stones in a narrow creek. 5 experienced hunters moved carefully along the bank, their boots sinking into damp moss. Each man had spent years in the backcountry, learning to track big game in harsh conditions. They were strong, well-armed, and confident in their skills. Among them was Mark Jensen, a guide who had led dozens of trips into these remote valleys. With him were Dale, a skilled marksman, Reed, known for his endurance on long treks, and 2 brothers, Owen and Luke, both raised in hunting camps since childhood. The group had been tracking signs of a massive grizzly for hours. Fresh prints as wide as dinner plates were pressed deep into the mud, leading toward the creek where salmon were moving upstream. Bits of fur snagged on low branches hinted at the bear's size. The men knew this was no ordinary animal. It was large, strong, and likely very protective of its feeding ground. They carried .300 Win Mag rifles, weapons powerful enough for big game, but they also knew that a bear could still cover ground faster than a person could react. As they neared a bend in the creek, the sound of splashing grew louder. Through the brush, they saw it. A massive grizzly, its fur wet and glistening in the low sun, standing over a pile of half-eaten fish. Its muscles shifted under thick fur as it tore at the carcasses, paying little attention to anything else. The men spread out slowly, using trees and rocks for cover. The plan was to get a clean shot from multiple angles, ending the hunt quickly. Mark raised his rifle first, steadying his aim. The others followed. A sharp crack rang out, echoing through the valley. The bear jerked and swung its head toward the sound, blood marking its side, but it didn't fall. Another shot followed, then another. The bullet struck, but instead of collapsing, the bear let out a deep, rolling roar that seemed to shake the ground beneath their boots. In a flash, it charged. The first man in its path was Dale. The bear slammed into him with a force that sent him sprawling into the moss. Its claws ripped through his sleeve, leaving a deep gash along his arm. Reed tried to fire, but the animal was too close. Its next swipe caught him across the shoulder, knocking him sideways into the brush. Luke stepped forward to take aim, but the bear's paw caught his side, sending him spinning to the ground with a heavy thud. Mark and Owen scrambled behind separate trees, firing as the bear turned toward them. The bullet struck again, slowing it just enough for the men to regroup. Breathing hard, the grizzly stopped at the edge of the creek, its eyes fixed on them. For a tense moment it stood still, chest heaving, before it turned and crashed into the trees, vanishing into the shadows. The men stood in silence, blood and dirt on their clothes, unaware that the encounter was far from over. The 5 men stood frozen for several seconds, their hearts still pounding from the charge. The forest had gone silent again, but every sound of rustling leaves or breaking branches made them turn their heads sharply. Dale's arm dripped blood, Reed's shoulder throbbed, and Luke's ribs ached where the heavy paw had struck. Mark signaled for everyone to gather close and check their injuries. None of them were in shape to continue tracking the animal, and the fading light meant they needed to make camp before nightfall. They moved slowly back toward a clearing near the water, each step heavy with the thought that the bear could still be watching. The tents went up quickly, fires lit for light rather than warmth. Their rifles stayed loaded and within reach. Supplies were spread out so they could treat wounds and prepare a simple meal, but none of them had much appetite. The smell of blood still lingered in the air, mixing with the damp scent of moss and wet leaves. Darkness came fast in the deep valley. Clouds hid the moon, and only the firelight kept the shadows from swallowing the camp completely. The men spoke little, their eyes often scanning the black line of trees beyond the glow. Somewhere out there, the wounded grizzly moved through the forest, its massive body silent when it chose to be. Hours passed. The fire had burned low, and the forest seemed to sleep. Then, faint at first, came the sound of twigs snapping. It grew louder, closer, until heavy steps could be heard in the undergrowth. Mark tightened his grip on his rifle. A deep grunt rolled out from the trees, followed by the glint of 2 eyes reflecting the firelight. The bear had returned. It emerged from the darkness with a low, steady growl, its breath visible in the cool night air. Blood still marked its side, but its movements were sure and strong. The scent of food and the memory of the earlier fight had brought it back. With one powerful swipe, it tore through the edge of a tent, scattering gear into the dirt. A pot clanged loudly as it was thrown aside. The men raised their rifles and fired into the ground, trying to drive it away without provoking another charge. The shots rang out, echoing off the valley walls. The bear hesitated, growled again, then smashed into another tent. Sleeping bags were torn apart and supplies were spilled across the ground. Another round of warning shots followed, louder this time. Finally, the massive shape turned away, disappearing into the trees with a crashing sound that faded into the distance. The men stayed awake until dawn, rifles ready, eyes fixed on the darkness. When morning came, the camp looked like a storm had passed through. Ripped fabric, broken gear, and footprints pressed deep into the soil. They packed quickly and left the valley without looking back. In the days that followed, the story spread through nearby towns. People spoke of the size of the bear, its refusal to give up, and how close the hunters had come to becoming prey. Wildlife officers warned that a wounded animal could be more dangerous than ever. The 5 men carried their scars home, each knowing the wild would remember them as surely as they remembered it. On November 18, 2022, cold air swept through the jagged ridges of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in northern New Mexico. Patches of snow clung to the shadowed slopes, and the ground was littered with dry pine needles that crunched under every step. 3 experienced hunters moved carefully along a narrow canyon trail, each carrying a .270 bolt-action rifle and wearing heavy packs. They had come for a single purpose: to track down a large mountain lion that had been killing livestock on nearby ranches for weeks. The leader of the group, Daniel Harper, was 42 and had hunted big game since his teenage years. He was known among ranchers for his skill in tracking predators. Alongside him was Mark Ellison, 38, a rancher himself who had lost 2 goats to the same lion earlier that month. The youngest was Ryan Cortez, 29, a quiet but determined hunter who often joined predator control efforts in the area. They had brought with them a team of well-trained hounds, dogs bred for generations to track the scent of cougars through difficult terrain. The morning had begun before sunrise, with frost covering the ground and the sharp call of ravens echoing across the valley. They had found fresh tracks near a frozen stream, large paw prints spaced wide apart, heading into the steep canyons. The dogs picked up the trail quickly, their excited barking carrying far through the cold air. The hunters followed, climbing over loose rock and ducking under low branches. The higher they went, the thinner the air became and the canyon walls closed in. For hours, the chase continued. The tracks wound upward, across narrow ledges and through tangled stands of juniper. At last, the barking changed tone, sharper, more urgent. The hunters knew what that meant. The dogs had cornered their quarry. They crept forward until the scene came into view. On a rocky shelf above them, framed by the fading light of the afternoon sun, the mountain lion stood tall and tense. Its golden eyes glowed in the dim light, ears flat against its head. A deep snarl rumbled from its throat, the sound carrying down to the hunters below. The cat's long tail lashed from side to side, muscles coiled like a spring. Daniel took the lead, stepping onto a slanted boulder for a better angle. His breath came slow, his rifle steady in his hands. The dogs barked wildly at the base of the rock, but the lion did not flee. Instead, it crouched lower, gaze fixed on the approaching figure. The tension in the air was heavy, broken only by the echo of barking and the sharp crack of loose stone underfoot. Then it happened. With explosive speed, the lion launched from its perch. Claws extended, its body arced through the air toward Daniel. The dogs scattered. Daniel shifted his rifle upward, but the big cat was already closing the gap. This was no retreat, it was an attack. The mountain lion struck with crushing force, knocking Daniel backward onto the rocky ground. His rifle slipped from his grasp as the cat's weight drove the air from his lungs. Claws tore across his jacket, slicing into the fabric and skin beneath. The sound of snapping cloth and deep growls filled the cold air. Daniel raised his arms to shield his face as the animal's teeth clamped down on his shoulder. Mark, just a few steps away, reacted instantly. He lifted his rifle, aimed low, and fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon walls. The bullet struck the lion's shoulder, making it twist to the side, but the animal did not stop. Instead, it leapt again, this time toward Mark. He barely had time to step back before one paw swiped across his forearm, leaving a long, bleeding gash. Ryan, who had been holding the dogs back, let them charge. The hounds surrounded the lion, barking and snapping, forcing it to turn in circles. Their noise gave Ryan just enough time to bring up his own rifle. He took a quick step to the side, found an opening between the dogs, and fired into the lion's chest. The impact drove the cat backward, its body crashing against the rock wall before it slid to the ground. For several seconds, no one moved. Steam rose from the lion's body into the cooling evening air. The dogs paced in tight circles, their barking slowly fading. Daniel pushed himself upright, his face pale and his shoulder bleeding freely. Mark gripped his wounded arm, teeth clenched against the pain. They gathered their packs and quickly dressed the wounds with bandages from their gear. The light was fading fast, shadows stretching long across the canyon floor. They decided to move toward a flatter area where they could be seen if help was needed. Daniel leaned heavily on Mark's good side while Ryan kept watch for any movement in the cliffs above. By the time they reached a small clearing, the last of the sun had dipped behind the peaks. They built a small fire to keep warm, its glow flickering across the rocks. The lion's body had been left where it fell, too heavy to carry through the steep terrain in the dark. Their plan was to return in the morning with better equipment. During the long night, none of them slept much. The cold pressed in from every side, and the sounds of the wilderness never fully stopped. At dawn, they began the slow climb back to the ledge. The hounds led the way, tails low but steady. The lion lay where it had fallen, the fur on its side ruffled by the wind. They took careful photographs and marked the site for wildlife officials. The carcass would be examined, not only to confirm the kill, but to understand why it had been so aggressive. Back in town later that day, news of the standoff spread quickly. Ranchers expressed relief that the predator would trouble livestock no more, but many noted the risk the hunters had taken. For Daniel, Mark, and Ryan, the encounter left more than scars. It was a reminder that even with skill, weapons, and preparation, the wild holds moments where survival depends on split seconds and unshaken resolve. The image of the mountain lion's final charge would remain with them for years. On January 14, 2023, the rolling hills near Provence lay under a pale winter sun, their fields edged with thickets of dense, thorny scrub. The air was sharp with cold, carrying the echo of barking dogs and the steady voices of hunters calling across the land. Among the 14 men gathered for the annual battue was Jean-Pierre Laurent, a 52-year-old with decades of experience in traditional drives. He had hunted these hills since his youth, learning every gully, ridge, and tangled patch of bramble. This hunt was not just sport. It was part of the long tradition of controlling the wild boar numbers that had been damaging crops and raiding vineyards. Jean-Pierre stood with his fellow hunters spread across a narrow corridor of land. Behind them, handlers worked the hounds, whose deep barks rang through the brambles. The plan was simple. The dogs would push the boars toward the waiting line, where the hunters could take clean shots. The men wore bright orange vests, their shotguns loaded, their boots already dusted with frost. Beneath the stillness of the open field, the hidden undergrowth stirred with life. The first signs came in quick bursts, rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and the rapid crash of heavy bodies pushing through the brush. A moment later, a massive boar broke from cover, its black hide scarred from past battles, its tusks long and sharp. It moved with terrifying speed, ignoring the open shooting lanes and instead charging directly toward Jean-Pierre's position. The impact came like a sledgehammer, knocking him backward into a wall of thorny vines. Pain tore across his back and arms as he struggled to lift his shotgun. Other hunters fired quickly, the blasts ringing out over the barking hounds, but the animal wheeled away into thicker cover. Before they could regroup, the brambles behind the rear line exploded once more. Out came a second enormous boar, heavier than the first, its eyes fixed on the nearest figure. One man raised his weapon, but the click of a misfire shattered his focus. Panic rippled through the line as the boar lunged. Its tusks grazed another hunter's leg, ripping fabric and drawing blood before two clean, close shots struck its chest. The beast collapsed in the frost-covered grass, its body steaming in the cold air. The chaos did not end there. From the edge of the drive, a third boar, smaller but wounded, slipped through a gap in the line, It vanished into the thickest part of the scrub before anyone could fire. Shouts rose to track it, and the dogs were called forward again. Men reloaded, eyes darting across every shadow in the thorn maze. The morning had already turned dangerous. But now the battue had shifted into something far more tense. Somewhere out in the brambles, an injured and desperate animal was waiting, and the hunters knew the real challenge had only just begun. Jean-Pierre pushed himself out of the thorns, his arms scratched and jacket torn. Around him, the others tightened their line, stepping into the scrub where the wounded boar had fled. The hounds darted forward, noses to the frozen ground, their sharp barks echoing in the narrow gullies. The hunters moved slowly, knowing a herd animal could be even more dangerous than one in full strength. Every step sent the sound of breaking twigs into the still winter air. The undergrowth thickened until it became almost a wall, with brambles pulling at clothes and cutting exposed skin. Breath came heavy as they pressed deeper, scanning for any sign of movement. Tracks appeared in the soft earth, deep prints with drops of dark blood marking the path. The line advanced carefully, weaving between dense shrubs and small clearings. Jean-Pierre gripped his shotgun tightly, his eyes fixed ahead, ready for the moment the animal turned. The sound of snapping branches came from the left. The dogs lunged toward it, barking louder, their voices rising with urgency. Then from beneath a low tangle of vines, the boar burst out, its mouth open in a soundless snarl. It charged through the nearest hunter's legs, sending him stumbling backward into the brush. The men reacted instantly. 2 shots rang out, hitting the thick muscle of its shoulder, but the beast kept running, weaving between the trees. The chase carried them over a small ridge and into a shallow ravine. The ground here was uneven, with hidden roots under the leaf litter. Jean-Pierre slid on the slope but kept his footing, following the trail of broken branches ahead. The boar's pace slowed, its body heavy with injury, yet it still managed to push forward, slipping in and out of sight. The hound stayed close, driving it toward another line of hunters who had moved to cut it off. At the far end of the ravine, the animal turned suddenly, its eyes wild, and rushed straight at the oncoming figures. This time, 3 guns fired almost as one. The impact stopped it mid-stride, and it collapsed with a thud that shook the ground. Steam rose from its body in the cold air. The hound circled once, then fell quiet. The hunters stood still for a moment, their breathing heavy, the tension slowly easing. They checked the man who had been knocked down earlier. His leg was bruised, but not broken. Jean-Pierre felt the sting of fresh cuts along his hands and face, but pushed them aside as he helped gather the group. Together, they dragged the heavy animal toward a clearing where the other boars from the morning were laid out. By the time the winter light began to fade, the battue was over. The men's clothes were torn, their boots coated in mud and bramble thorns. Though successful, the hunt had left its mark on everyone. Back in the small village, the story spread quickly, how the drive had turned into a running battle through the thorns, and how close the hunters had come to disaster. For Jean-Pierre, the day was a reminder that even with years of experience, the wild always holds the power to surprise. On October 27, 2022, the cold winds of Montana's northern Rockies swept through the tall pines and steep ridges. Mark, a 45-year-old hunter with decades of outdoor experience, moved quietly along a game trail. Born and raised in a small mountain town, he had learned early from his father how to read signs in the forest, how to track animals through snow, and how to keep calm in the face of danger. For years, autumn meant one thing to him: elk season. Each trip into the wild was both a test of skill and a way to connect with the land he loved. That morning, Mark had set out before sunrise, carrying a scoped .300 Win Mag rifle slung over his shoulder. His pack contained a tarp, flint, extra clothes, jerky, and other essential survival items. The air was crisp, and frost clung to the grass. Moving slowly between thick stands of timber, he had spotted fresh elk tracks leading toward a shaded valley. The sun climbed higher, and his steps stayed measured as he stalked through damp undergrowth. By midday, his patience paid off. Through a small opening, he saw a large bull elk grazing. He crouched, steadying his breathing, and raised the rifle. One careful shot dropped the animal. Mark felt the quiet pride that came after a successful hunt. But as he began field dressing the elk, a thin mist began to drift between the trees. The fog thickened fast, wrapping the forest in a white wall. Within minutes, the shapes of trees blurred and the trail back vanished. Mark packed what meat he could carry and started moving, relying on memory to guide him. But each direction looked the same in the haze. Hours passed and the air grew colder. Then, as if the day had not turned hard enough, heavy snow began to fall. Thick, wet flakes covered the ground, bending the branches low. His boots sank into the fresh layer with each step. The temperature dropped sharply, chilling his fingers even inside his gloves. The forest grew darker, and his sense of direction began to fade. He knew wandering without a plan could be deadly in such conditions. He needed shelter before night set in. Searching for a good spot, he found a cluster of fallen trees near a rock face that blocked the wind. Working quickly, he used his knife to strip branches, laying them against a thick trunk to form a lean-to. His hands ached from the cold, but he pushed on. From his pack, he pulled out flint and a handful of dry birch bark he had collected earlier in the day. Sparks caught, and soon a small flame flickered in the growing dark. He fed it with twigs and then larger pieces of wood until a steady fire warmed the air inside the shelter. Outside, the snow piled deeper, and the forest was silent except for the wind. The first night in the blizzard was only beginning, and the fight to survive had just started. Snow kept falling through the night, building a white wall around the shelter. Mark sat close to the fire, feeding it steady fuel. The heat kept his hands from going numb, but the air outside the lean-to felt like ice on his skin. Every few minutes he checked the flames to be sure they would not die. His tarp blocked some wind, but cold still crept in through the gaps. When morning came, light barely reached the forest floor. The sky was covered in thick gray clouds and the snow showed no sign of stopping. Mark moved slowly, stretching his legs to keep his blood flowing. He melted handfuls of snow in a small metal cup to drink and chewed on thin strips of jerky. The food was not much, but he knew he had to make it last. His breath hung in the air and his clothing stayed damp from the day before. He worked to dry them by the fire, rotating each layer. The second day was harder. The cold seemed sharper and the silence pressed in on him. He heard no birds, no movement, only the steady hiss of falling snow. Tracks of the elk were now buried under fresh layers. He kept watch for signs of predators, knowing mountain lions and wolves could be nearby. Once he noticed faint movement between the trees, a dark shape, but it vanished before he could be sure what it was. His rifle stayed close, ready if needed. By the third day, fatigue began to set in. His body ached from sitting on the hard ground, and his hands felt stiff even when warmed by the flames. He broke more branches to keep the fire alive, working slowly to avoid slipping on the icy layer forming beneath the snow. The weight of the weather was heavy, but he forced himself to stay focused. Every sound became important. Every hour felt longer than the last. That afternoon, he decided to make a signal that could be seen from above. Using a clear patch near the shelter, he stamped large letters into the snow, wide enough for an aircraft to notice. He also set aside a small pile of dry wood that could burn quickly to create smoke if he heard anything in the distance. His hope rested on the chance that someone was looking for him. On the fourth day, a faint sound broke the stillness. It was distant, almost lost in the wind, but it was not from the forest. He grabbed the dry wood and placed it on the fire, feeding the flames until they roared high and sent a dark column into the sky. The noise grew louder, voices carried through the trees. Relief surged through him as figures in bright jackets appeared between the pines. Searchers moved quickly toward the shelter, checking his condition before guiding him out. The walk back was slow, but each step felt lighter. Once in safety, he was given warm food and blankets. The storm had passed, but the memory stayed sharp. Mark knew the only reason he made it home was preparation, calm thinking, and never giving up in the cold silence of the mountains. On September 6, 2023, in the far reaches of northern Minnesota's thick forests, the air was cool and still as evening shadows stretched long across the ground. Travis, a seasoned bow hunter in his mid-30s, sat high in a tree stand 20 feet above the forest floor. He had been hunting since his teenage years, taught by his father and grandfather in the same woods. Years of experience had taught him patience, silence, and careful preparation. He often hunted for whitetail during the early season, favoring evenings when deer crept through the fading light. Travis had arrived at his chosen spot well before sunset, climbing the ladder to his stand with slow, careful steps. His bow rested within easy reach and his gear was tied neatly to the platform. The forest around him was alive with soft sounds, birds settling in for the night, the faint rustle of squirrels in the leaves below. His clothes carried no scent, his movements were almost invisible, and he had not made a single sound for hours. The air was calm and everything felt just right for deer to appear. Unnoticed by him, however, a small detail would soon change everything. At the bottom of his pack, tied to the stand just below his seat, sat an unopened granola bar. He had tossed it in earlier that morning without much thought. It would prove to be an irresistible mistake. As the light began to fade, Travis heard a new sound. At first it was faint, something scratching against bark. His eyes searched the ground for the source. Between the trunks, a large black bear moved slowly, its nose sweeping from side to side as it caught the scent. Its dark fur blended with the shadows, but its size was unmistakable. The bear circled once at the base of the tree, sniffing the air before looking straight up toward the stand. Without hesitation, it began to climb. Powerful claws dug deep into the trunk, pulling its heavy body upward with ease. Travis remained perfectly still at first, knowing sudden movement could startle the animal into unpredictable action. The distance between them closed quickly, 15 feet, then 12. Each scratch of a claw against wood echoed sharply in the quiet woods. At 10 feet, the bear's head turned and its dark eyes met his. The moment was tense, the stillness broken only by the bear's deep breaths as it continued its climb. Travis shifted slightly, pressing his boots against the stand's footrest and pushing hard to make noise. The metal rang faintly, but the bear continued on. Its strength and focus were unshaken. Another few seconds passed before the bear's front paw gripped the edge of the platform. The entire stand trembled slightly under the added weight. Travis knew there was no more time to hesitate. The hunter's calm patience was replaced with the knowledge that this was no longer about waiting for deer. This was about avoiding an encounter that could turn deadly in an instant. The bear was almost level with him now, its broad shoulders filling the narrow space between the branches. Travis reached for the compact sidearm holstered at his waist, his fingers moving with steady speed despite the pounding in his chest. The bear's claws scraped against the metal frame of the stand as it hauled itself higher, muscles shifting under thick black fur. The platform swayed slightly with every pull. The hunter angled his arm outward, aiming just past the animal's head. The sound of the shot split the still air. A burst of dirt and bark flew from the trunk inches from the bear's ear. The sudden blast made the animal jerk backward, its grip loosened, and its body slid a few feet down the trunk. With a powerful twist, the bear dropped from the tree altogether, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Dry leaves scattered in all directions as it scrambled up, turning once to glare with dark, unreadable eyes. Then, without warning, it bolted into the thick undergrowth, vanishing among the shadows. For a long moment, Travis stayed frozen, every sense tuned to the faintest sound. His ears rang from the shot, and the smell of burnt powder hung in the air. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Slowly, he lowered the weapon and let it rest in his lap. His heartbeat began to slow, but his body still felt charged with restless energy. He knew it was no longer safe to remain in the stand. With deliberate, quiet movements, he gathered his bow and unfastened the pack. The granola bar was still there, untouched, but now clearly the cause of the encounter. He slung the gear over his shoulder, climbed down the ladder one rung at a time, and kept his eyes sweeping the shadows for movement. On the ground, the air felt cooler, the light thinner. Every snap of a twig made him glance over his shoulder. He followed the narrow trail back toward the truck, stepping carefully over roots and fallen branches. The scent of pine was heavy, but beneath it, his mind still imagined the musky odor of the bear. By the time he reached the clearing where his vehicle was parked, the first stars had begun to appear in the sky. He placed his gear inside, locked the doors, and sat behind the wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. His hands rested on the steering wheel, still tense from holding the weapon. When the vehicle finally rumbled to life, the sound felt like a barrier between him and the dark forest. Back home later that night, Travis laid out his gear for inspection. The pack was intact, though the faint scent of food lingered around it. He removed the snack and sealed it away. The sidearm was cleaned and reloaded, the bow placed back in its case. The events replayed in his head in sharp, clear fragments. The steady climb of the animal, the weight on the platform, the sudden retreat. Over the next few days, he shared the experience with a few fellow hunters. They listened closely, some nodding with understanding. It was a reminder that in bear country, even elevated stands offer no guarantee of safety if food is involved. The smallest oversight could bring an animal directly into striking distance. Travis returned to the woods a week later, but this time with extra care. No food came with him, no sense that might carry on the wind. His focus was sharper, his senses more alert. The forest was the same, but he saw it differently now. Every rustle, every shadow, a reminder of the moment when the line between hunter and hunted had nearly vanished. The quiet beauty of the land was still there, but so too was its unpredictable danger. The lesson would remain as deeply rooted as the trees themselves. On November 28, 2022, in the cold heart of Alaska's interior, the air was sharp enough to sting the lungs. The land was wrapped in snow, and the frozen lakes reflected pale light from a weak afternoon sun. Cal had grown up in the state, learning to hunt from his father before he could even carry his rifle. He was known among friends for patience, strong aim, and a habit of studying animal movements for hours before making a move. Mason, his longtime hunting partner, had moved north a decade earlier from the lower 48. He had quickly adapted to the extreme conditions, learning to track moose and caribou in some of the most unforgiving terrain. Together they had shared many trips, but this one would test them in a way neither expected. The rut was almost over and the big bulls were slower now, conserving energy after weeks of constant movement. The day before, a local trapper had mentioned spotting a large moose at the edge of a remote lake. It was enough to draw the two men deep into the wilderness with their rifles, Cal carrying a .338, Mason a .300, hoping for one last chance before the season closed. The lake was a sheet of white and blue, its surface mostly solid but lined with dark cracks near the shallows. They stepped carefully, boots crunching on patches of drifted snow over the ice. The sound of their breathing echoed in the wide stillness. Every few steps they stopped to scan the tree line through binoculars, watching for movement. It was Mason who first caught sight of it. A massive bull emerging from the shadowed spruce. Its antlers were heavy and wide, each tine coated with frost. Steam puffed from its muzzle as it lowered its head and let out a deep, rumbling grunt that rolled across the frozen surface. Cal steadied his view, noting the broad chest and thick winter coat. It was the kind of animal hunters remember for years. Then, without warning, the bull moved forward. Its hooves struck the ice with quick, awkward steps, slipping but regaining balance each time. The pace quickened. The sound of its approach, hooves scraping, ice cracking, breath rushing, grew louder with each second. The men adjusted their stance, rifles rising. The ice beneath them groaned, sending a shiver down their legs. Cal squeezed the trigger, sending a shot wide to the side, hoping the sound alone might turn the bull. It didn't slow. Mason aimed for the shoulder, the rifle kicking hard as the shot connected. The moose stumbled, sliding across the slick surface, but its momentum carried it forward. At barely 15 yards, the cracks in the ice gave way under its weight. The front legs plunged through first, followed by a sudden drop of its massive frame. Cold water exploded upward, scattering shards of ice. The bull thrashed violently, its antlers sweeping low as it fought to pull free. The hunters stepped back quickly, rifles still aimed, breaths sharp in the freezing air. The lake had turned the chase into something else entirely, and the outcome was far from certain. The bull's body twisted in the freezing hole, sending waves under the thin surface. Ice splintered further as its hind legs kicked wildly, striking the edges in a spray of white shards. Its heavy head swung from side to side, antlers cutting deep lines into the frozen rim. Cal and Mason moved several steps farther toward the shoreline, keeping their footing solid. The sound of splashing mixed with the deep grunts of the trapped animal echoed across the open basin. The water churned dark around the bull's chest, its fur slick and glistening with frost. Steam rose from its back as the cold bit hard. The cracks spread outward, creating a network of jagged lines across the lake's surface. Every surge of its powerful frame widened the hole. The men watched with steady eyes, knowing a wrong move on their part could mean their weight breaking the ice. The animal's movement slowed, not from surrender, but from the deep shock of the freezing water. Each breath came in thick bursts, and its eyes rolled with the strain. For a moment, its front legs found a purchase on the rim, and it heaved upward, lifting half its body from the water. The ice collapsed again, sending it crashing back into the dark hole. The sound was sharp, almost like timber splitting. The hunters remained still, rifles lowered but ready, their boots anchored on firmer patches. The chase was over, but not in the way either had imagined when they crossed the lake. The bull's fight became less frantic, replaced with slow, steady motions as it turned toward a narrow section of thicker ice. Its shoulders rose high as it made one final push, breaking into a shallow fringe where the water barely reached its knees. It staggered, slipping sideways before finding balance, then lurched toward the far tree line. Cal and Mason stayed back, watching its massive shape fade between the shadows of the spruce. They did not follow. The lake's voice, a steady groan and pop, reminded them how close they had been to joining the animal in the icy trap. Snow began to drift from the low clouds, soft flakes settling over the open space where the struggle had happened. They circled wide around the hazard, boots crunching over solid ground until they reached the slope leading away from the water. Behind them, the hole in the ice still gaped, jagged edges marking the place where the frozen skin had given way. Small ripples lapped against the edges before the surface began to freeze again. Once off the lake, they paused near a stand of tall spruce, letting the wind carry away the heat from their faces. The rifles felt heavier now, not from the weight of steel but from the day's strain. The forest around them was quiet except for the faint whisper of falling snow. They both understood that the land had made the decision for them, and no shot could have ended it differently. By dusk, the light had drained from the sky, leaving only the pale shimmer of the frozen expanse behind them. The memory of the charge, the sound of cracking ice, and the sight of the bull's wide antlers breaking through the water would stay with them. The hunt had closed without a kill, yet it had carved a sharper respect for the place they walked. In that stretch of wilderness, the rules were not theirs to set. The lake had spoken, and they had listened.